Life in Elmwood Heights had always felt stable, like a comfortable, well-worn armchair you sank into at the end of a long day. I was Beatrice Finley, 52 years old, and I'd spent the last 25 of those years working at Elmwood Heights Elementary School, not as a teacher, but in the administrative office. I was the one who knew where everything was, who the parents were, and who could calm a crying child with a single smile. People saw me as reliable, kind, perhaps a little quiet, but always ready with a helpful word. They saw the outwardly charming Beatrice. What they didn't see was the intricate web of resentments I carefully kept tucked away, or the manipulative streak that sometimes guided my seemingly innocent actions. For years, the anchor of that stability for me and for the whole school was Principal Sterling, Mr. Sterling. He wasn't just a principal, he was the heart of Elmwood Heights Elementary. Always calm, always fair, his office door was always open. He knew every student's name, every teacher's strength, and he navigated the often treacherous waters of parent politics with grace and wisdom. He was a true pillar of the community, a mentor to me in ways he likely never fully realized. He'd guided me through tough office transitions, listened when I needed an ear, and always made me feel like my quiet contribution mattered. He represented everything good and decent about our little corner of the world. My days were routine, predictable. Arrive before the first bus, unlock the front doors, brew the coffee that only Mr. Sterling and I truly appreciated, answer the constantly ringing phones, handle late slips, bandage scraped knees, and interact with the endless stream of parents. Most parents were lovely, supportive, appreciative. Then there were others. The demanding ones, the entitled ones, the ones who seemed to view the school as their personal complaint department rather than a place of learning. One family in particular always seemed to vibrate at a slightly more annoying frequency. The Miller family, I knew them by sight, of course. The mother always perfectly coiffed with a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. The father, loud and opinionated, carrying an air of self-importance like a heavy cloak. Their son was in the younger grades, maybe first or second that year. A quiet boy, seemed sweet enough, certainly didn't seem to have inherited his parents' abrasive nature. That year, the boy had Mrs. Collins for a teacher. Mrs. Collins was an acquired taste, a bit eccentric, prone to long, rambling stories, but fundamentally a good person who cared about her students. She wasn't everyone's cup of tea, but she was harmless. Trouble started brewing subtly. Whispers in the hallway when the Millers were in the office. More frequent phone calls from them, their voices tight with complaint. It seemed they weren't happy with Mrs. Collins. They thought she was ineffective, maybe even a little weird, which, okay, fair enough, but their complaints escalated quickly from mild dissatisfaction to outright demands. I heard bits and pieces from the office, overheard phone calls, and hushed conversations between Mr. Sterling and the Millers. They weren't just complaining anymore, they were making accusations. I saw the stress lines deepen around Mr. Sterling's eyes. He handled it with his usual composure, listening patiently, explaining school policy, trying to mediate. But the Millers were relentless. They wanted Mrs. Collins gone, and they weren't backing down. Then came the meeting, the one that changed everything. The Millers requested a private meeting with Mr. Sterling. It was scheduled for after school, long after the last child had been picked up. I was still in the office, tidying up, filing away the day's paperwork. My presence was routine, parents often stayed late for meetings, and I was just part of the background noise. The meeting room was just down the hall from the main office. The walls were thin, I couldn't help but hear snippets, raised voices, frustrated tones. It was the Millers doing most of the yelling. Mr. Sterling's voice was a low, steady baritone trying to de-escalate, then a silence, a heavy, tense silence, and then I heard it. The mother's voice, cold and clear, cutting through the quiet, something about taking this higher. The father's voice, a low growl mentioning repercussions. And then the line that I later learned from a shell-shocked Mr. Sterling had been delivered with deliberate malice. A threat against a child's academic record. I didn't hear the exact words then, just the chilling tone and Mr. Sterling's sharp intake of breath. But I saw his face when they finally left, pale, drawn, something profoundly broken in his usually kind eyes. He didn't say much, just sighed and ran a hand through his hair. They went too far this time, Beatrice, he murmured, shaking his head. He looked utterly defeated. I didn't know the full extent of the threat until later, piecing it together from whispers and concerned colleagues. The Millers, apparently frustrated that Mr. Sterling wouldn't immediately fire Mrs. Collins based on their complaints, had escalated the situation by threatening to leverage their influence, perhaps connections on the school board or within the community, to negatively impact their own child's educational standing if their demands weren't met. They weren't just threatening Mr. Sterling's job, they were threatening to harm their own son's future just to get back at the school for not bowing to their will. It was monstrous, and they had used it as a weapon against Mr. Sterling, implying his lack of cooperation would lead to this self-inflicted wound on their child, which they would then blame on him. It was a twisted, cruel form of emotional blackmail and professional sabotage. What followed was a blur of hushed phone calls, urgent meetings behind closed doors, and an oppressive atmosphere settling over the school. Mr. Sterling was under review. Mrs. Collins, too, though her situation seemed secondary to his. The superintendent got involved. There were investigations. Through it all, the Millers remained outwardly composed, even smug. I saw them dropping off their son, smiling that tight smile, waving just a little too cheerfully. They acted as if they were the wronged parties, brave crusaders exposing incompetence, rather than people who had used a child's future as a bargaining chip and targeted a good man. My resentment towards them began to simmer. They had disrupted the peace, threatened a child, and worst of all in my eyes, put Mr. Sterling's career and reputation in jeopardy. The end came swiftly, brutally. An announcement was made. Mr. Sterling would not be returning the following year, neither would Mrs. Collins. It was framed as a mutual decision, a transition, but everyone knew the truth. Mr. Sterling, after decades of dedicated service, forced out because of the relentless, cruel pressure from one entitled family. He left quietly with dignity, but the light had gone out of his eyes. My world tilted. The stability was gone. The comfortable armchair felt empty. Mr. Sterling was my professional compass, my mentor, the quiet force that made coming to work feel meaningful. And he was gone, banished by the Millers. The injustice of it settled in my gut like a stone. Those parents, with their manufactured outrage and their despicable tactics, had taken away a good man, a vital part of our community, and they had gone away with it. The surface of my charming facade began to crack just for me to see. Beneath it, a hard, cold determination began to form. They thought they had won. They thought they could disrupt lives, destroy careers, and walk away unscathed, back to their perfect house and their perfect life, feeling justified. They were wrong. They had targeted the wrong person to cross, not just Mr. Sterling, but someone who considered him a mentor and a friend, someone who believed they needed to pay for the void they had created. The resentment solidified into a burning need for retribution. They had taken something precious from me, from us, and I was going to take something precious from them. The fight had just begun. If you're enjoying this story and want to hear more tales of people getting what they deserve, subscribe to Tales of Revenge channel for new revenge stories daily. Act 2, Struggle, the desperation and descent into darkness. The weeks and months that followed Mr. Sterling's departure were bleak. The school felt different. A new principal arrived, competent but lacking the warmth, the history, the soul that Mr. Sterling had embodied. Mrs. Collins was replaced by someone younger, more conventional. The comfortable hum of Elmwood Heights Elementary had been replaced by a cautious silence, an undercurrent of unease. Everyone knew what had happened or suspected, and everyone knew who was responsible. The Millers. My outwardly charming demeanor remained intact for the most part. I still smiled at parents, helped students, processed paperwork, but inside, the resentment festered. It wasn't just about Mr. Sterling anymore. It was about the sheer arrogance of the Millers, their willingness to use such cruel tactics, their blatant disregard for the well-being of others as long as they got their way. It was about the feeling of powerlessness, watching something good be dismantled by people who seemed to embody everything I disliked. I tried at first to find another way, to hope that karma would somehow catch up with them. Maybe their son would struggle in the new class. Maybe the community would subtly ostracize them. But life seemed to go on for the Millers uninterrupted. They still attended school events, their son seemed perfectly fine, and they carried on with their lives as if nothing had happened, as if they hadn't left a trail of disruption and hurt in their wake. This apparent immunity only fueled my anger. It wasn't enough for me to just hope for consequences. I felt a growing, undeniable urge to ensure them. My manipulative nature, usually confined to subtle office politics or getting exactly the kind of stationery I preferred, began to turn towards a darker purpose. I started observing the Millers more closely, listening more intently whenever their name came up. Where did they live? What did they do? Who were their friends? What did they value? I learned the father, Mr. Miller, was a partner in a local law firm. The mother, Mrs. Miller, was heavily involved in various community groups, particularly fundraising for the local hospital wing. They were pillars of a certain kind of community, the wealthy, influential kind. They had social standing, reputations to uphold. These weren't just names on a school roster anymore, they were targets. My initial thoughts were small, petty, slashing their tires, leaving a scathing anonymous note. But those felt insufficient, like scratching an itch that required deep surgical precision. They hadn't just inconvenienced Mr. Sterling, they had fundamentally altered his life, his career, his sense of purpose. They had left him adrift. Whatever I did had to reflect that level of disruption, that level of loss. It had to hit them where they lived, where they felt secure. The psychological toll began to mount. My thoughts became consumed with the Millers. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, turning over ideas, discarding them, fueled by a cold, simmering rage. My outward charm felt increasingly like a mask, heavy and suffocating. I'd smile and nod, but my mind was elsewhere, plotting, calculating. It was isolating. I couldn't talk about this with anyone. My colleagues still mourned Mr. Sterling in their own ways, but none seemed to harbor the deep-seated need for vengeance that consumed me. They moved on. I couldn't. My sense of purpose, felt intertwined with Mr. Sterling's legacy, and in my mind, the Millers had desecrated it. I started spending evenings researching. Not just the Millers, but their firm, the hospital foundation the mother supported, their neighborhood. I became intimately familiar with their public lives, and the more I learned, the more apparent their vulnerabilities became. Reputation, influence, social standing. These were their currencies, their shields, and they were also potential targets. I faced setbacks, small failures that only intensified my resolve. I tried subtly spreading rumors among parents about the circumstances of Mr. Sterling's departure, hoping to turn public opinion against the Millers. It worked a little, but the Millers were too well connected, too skilled at damage control. The whispers faded. I attempted to find dirt on Mr. Miller's law firm, something unethical or unprofessional, but their public record was clean, their reputation solid. Each dead end chipped away at my patience, deepened my frustration, and pushed me closer to more drastic measures. I started thinking about their money, their influence. their social circle. These weren't just abstract concepts, they were the foundations of the Millers' power and security. Striking at their finances or their standing within their elite circle felt like the most direct way to inflict the kind of pain they had inflicted on Mr. Sterling's professional life. My manipulation skills, honed over years of navigating school politics, became sharper, colder. I started cultivating acquaintances in circles that intersected with the Millers. Joining a local charity group, attending community events I would previously have skipped. I used my outward charm to disarm people, listening, observing, gathering fragments of information about the Millers' lives, their habits, their weaknesses. It was slow, painstaking work, requiring immense self-control to maintain the facade while my insides seethed. There were moments of doubt, brief flashes of questioning what I was doing. Was this healthy? Was this right? But then I would remember Mr. Sterling's face that day, the defeat in his eyes, the quiet way he packed his office, the void left in the school. I would remember the Millers' smug expressions, their entitlement, and the doubt would evaporate, replaced by a cold, hard certainty. They deserved this. They had earned whatever was coming to them. My motivation wasn't just abstract justice, it was personal, deeply ingrained retribution for disrupting my life and destroying my mentor's career. My rock bottom wasn't a single dramatic event, but a slow, corrosive process. It was the realization that my life had become entirely defined by this quest for vengeance. My free time was spent planning, researching, observing. My interactions were filtered through the lens of how they could serve my purpose. The cheerful, quiet Beatrice Finley was a ghost, replaced by someone colder, more calculating, consumed by a singular goal. I looked in the mirror sometimes and barely recognized the person staring back. The resentment had hollowed me out, leaving only the hard core of my vengeful determination. It was at this point, when I felt most lost in the darkness of my obsession, that the final pieces began to click into place. Through my quiet observation and subtle inquiries, I started to uncover something vulnerable, something the Millers kept carefully hidden behind their polished facade. Every person, no matter how powerful, has a secret, and I was about to find theirs. The path forward was becoming clearer, more specific. It would require patience, precision, and leveraging the very traits I had cultivated over a lifetime. The outward charm to get close, the manipulation to orchestrate events, and the deep well of resentment to fuel the entire endeavor. The struggle had hardened me, now it was time for the reckoning. Don't forget, if you're enjoying this dive into the shadows of revenge, subscribe to Tales of Revenge channel for new revenge stories daily. Act 3, Revenge the Reckoning, its execution and the aftermath. My transformation wasn't sudden or dramatic in the way stories often depict. It was a quiet crystallization of intent. Rock bottom hadn't broken me, it had forged me into something sharp and focused. The doubts had faded, replaced by an unwavering resolve. The Beatrice Finley who had admired Mr. Sterling and valued the stability of the school was still there, but she was now overlaid with a layer of cold, strategic purpose. My manipulative streak, once a minor character trait, was now the lead player. My resentment was the engine. My charm was the camouflage. Through months of patient observation and careful inquiries, I had discovered something about Mr. Miller's law firm. Not a grand scandal, but something smaller, more human, and potentially far more damaging to his carefully constructed reputation within his specific, affluent circle. It involved a conflict of interest, a discreet breach of client confidentiality concerning a wealthy, influential family in town, a family that also happened to be close friends with several members of the hospital board the Millers' mother tirelessly fundraised for. It wasn't illegal, perhaps, depending on the specifics, but it was unethical, unprofessional, and if exposed, could severely damage Mr. Miller's standing at his firm and within their shared social circles. More importantly, it could ripple outwards and impact Mrs. Miller's standing within the community groups she valued so highly. It was a weakness I could exploit. The plan was intricate, requiring finesse and timing. I wouldn't confront them directly. That wasn't my style, and it wouldn't cause the kind of lingering, reputation-damaging harm I sought. My revenge needed to be insidious, planting seeds of doubt and suspicion that would grow and choke their carefully cultivated image. First, I needed access. Access to the right people, the right information. My long history at the school, my reputation as the quiet, helpful office lady became my greatest asset. I was invisible in plain sight. I started volunteering more at school events the Millers attended, always offering a helping hand, a kind word. They barely noticed me beyond a polite nod. I used my charm to gather scraps of information, overhearing conversations, asking seemingly innocent questions to parents who knew the Millers socially. I pieced together who their closest friends were, who they socialized with, who held influence in the circles they cared about. My focus narrowed to two key individuals: a woman named Alina Vance, a prominent figure on the hospital board and a close friend of Mrs. Miller, and a man named Thomas Croft, a rival lawyer who had history with Mr. Miller's firm and was known for his sharp tongue and competitive nature. My manipulation began subtly. I found opportunities to interact with Alina Vance at school functions. I offered to help with the hospital foundation's next fundraiser, leveraging my reputation for being organized and reliable. Once I was within her orbit, I began ever so gently to introduce carefully crafted questions, seemingly out of simple curiosity. "Oh, I heard Mr. Miller's firm was involved in that case with the Henderson family last year. Such a complex situation, wasn't it?" Or, "It's amazing how Mr. Miller manages his workload. I understand his clients require such." Discretion, I never accused directly. I merely planted hints, vague references to things I shouldn't possibly know, framing them as innocent inquiries or misunderstood gossip I'd supposedly overheard elsewhere. I let Alina's own mind fill in the blanks, knowing that even a whiff of unprofessional conduct from someone she considered a peer and friend would be unsettling to her. Concurrently, I found a way to connect with Thomas Croft. A chance meeting at a local coffee shop, facilitated by subtly altering my routine to intersect with his. I presented myself as a concerned citizen, someone who had been impacted by Mr. Miller's actions, referencing Mr. Sterling's departure in vague terms, painting the Millers as difficult and unethical. I mentioned the same specific client situation I had hinted at with Alina, framing it as a potential breach of trust that had troubled me. I knew Croft's competitive nature, the idea of a rival firm partner having potentially compromised ethics would be like blood in the water. I provided just enough detail, a name, a vague timeline to pique his professional interest without revealing my source or direct involvement. The execution was like setting a series of dominoes in motion. Alina Vance, unsettled by my subtle hints and her own professional standards, would likely start asking quiet questions within her circle, perhaps even to Mrs. Miller herself, introducing a seed of distrust. Thomas Croft, seeing an opportunity or simply driven by professional rivalry and perhaps a genuine concern about legal ethics, would likely start digging into the matter, perhaps making discreet inquiries or spreading calculated whispers within the legal community. My role was to facilitate, to nudge, to plant the right information in the right ears at the right time. I continued to be the charming, helpful Beatrice, utterly above suspicion. I watched from the periphery as the seeds I planted began to sprout. There were hushed conversations at town events, awkward silences when the Millers entered a room, subtle shifts in how people interacted with them. I heard snippets from parents. The Millers weren't hosting their usual holiday party this year. Mrs. Miller had stepped down from a prominent committee on the hospital board, citing personal reasons. Mr. Miller's name was less frequently mentioned in the local paper's business section. The ripples were spreading exactly as I had intended. Their social standing, their influence, their carefully constructed world was beginning to crumble, not with a bang, but with a slow, suffocating erosion of trust and reputation. The feeling of satisfaction was profound, almost intoxicating. It wasn't loud or triumphant. It was a deep, quiet certainty that justice of a sort was being served. They had destroyed Mr. Sterling's professional life through manipulation and pressure. I was destroying their social and professional lives through subtle manipulation and leveraging their own vulnerabilities. The proportionality felt correct. They were experiencing the loss of something they valued deeply, their standing in the community, their professional respect, just as they had caused Mr. Sterling to lose his. The consequences for the Millers continued to unfold over months. Their social circle seemed to shrink. Business relationships became strained. The whispers persisted, gaining traction not because of irrefutable proof, but because the initial hints came from unexpected, seemingly reliable sources, Alina Vance and Thomas Croft, acting on their own assumptions based on my planted information. The beauty of it was that I was untraceable. The information I'd hinted at was just enough to be plausible, just vague enough to be impossible to trace back to me directly, and for me, there was no grand, cathartic release. The all-consuming need for revenge had left a void. The resentment was gone, replaced by a strange emptiness. I had achieved my goal, the Millers were paying, but the feeling of stability that Mr. Sterling had represented was still missing. I hadn't brought him back, and I hadn't truly restored the sense of peace he embodied. My victory was personal and cold, not communal or warm. My life at the school went on. I was still the quiet, reliable Beatrice. People still smiled at me, asked for help. But inside, I knew I was fundamentally changed. The charming facade was still there, but it felt thinner, more fragile. I had crossed a line, stepped into a darkness I hadn't known was within me. The resolution wasn't a happy ending. It was an ending to that chapter. The Millers were diminished, their power curtailed, their carefully guarded reputations tarnished within their own world. I had made them pay for disrupting my life and destroying Mr. Sterling's career. But I was left with the quiet knowledge of what I had done, the manipulative depths I was capable of reaching. As for the final twist, a few years later I heard through the grapevine that Mr. Sterling had resurfaced. Not in Elmwood Heights, but in a neighboring town, taking on a similar administrative role at a different school. He seemed happier, finding his footing again. The news brought me a strange mix of relief and melancholy. He had recovered, moved on. While I had been consumed by vengeance, stuck in the past, he had quietly rebuilt his future. My elaborate revenge, while impactful for the Millers, ultimately had little bearing on Mr. Sterling's long-term trajectory. The true satisfaction I realized hadn't come from helping him, but purely from causing pain to those who had hurt him. A sobering thought to live with, so there it is. The Millers got their comeuppance, orchestrated by the quiet woman in the school office they barely noticed. It wasn't just about them. It was about my mentor, the life they disrupted, and the person I became because of it. And that's a story you can only hear if you subscribe to Tales of Revenge channel for new revenge stories daily.